Hey there, trainers, and welcome back to Future Sight, which is, of course, a soundproof podcast production. As you can see to my bottom, I can never do this backwards. Right, left. I am, as always.
You see it.
I am, as always, Brendan, Mr. B-Dog46, as you may know me online, and I'm joined by my good pal Jake, who goes by Major Bowman. Sometimes there's an underscore, and sometimes there's not. And we're back here with a regularly scheduled bi-weekly episode, which we had slacked on due to technical difficulties, which are now
I wouldn't say we
fixed,
slacked
apparently.
on. You didn't have a computer.
Yeah, it's fine. And apparently just wiping your computer down to its bones and then building it back up is enough to make it work. So here we are again for the second week in a row. We're excited to dive into a little bit of VGC 2017 this week, and I believe we've done one of those matches before where we were talking about Gact and fake PG and the advent of acronyms.
That was the big
in
acronym,
VGC,
yeah, for sure.
And I believe at this point in the format, we're actually pre-acronym, which is exciting. So all these teams are organic, exciting, interesting, but you'll see some familiar faces.
Yeah.
So let's throw or do we talk about some VGC? Okay. So anyway, we talked a little bit about VGC 17, but we'll kind of talk about it a little bit more, which is basically we're at a point where we've got a regional dex, but it's got Tapus and Ultra Beasts in it, which is like a jam-packed regional dex. And with the Z crystals that are around, typically is making, well, with the exception of Celesteela Mirrors, is making for like a pretty fast-paced metagame as a result.
Yeah, I think like Celesteela Mirrors, Porygon 2, some Snorlax stuff, those are really the only like slow-moving things in the format. But most of the time, a lot of stuff is going to be hitting like fast and hard. Like Garchomp being like the number one Pokemon in the format all year, I think is an example of that, because Garchomp's going to do nothing except try to do a bunch of damage. And I think, honestly, a lot of the format is how can I beat Garchomp, because there are so few viable like ground immunities, which was one, weird for Garchomp users, aka everyone, because you had to have something Earthquake next to, and two, it made it more difficult defensively. Groundium helps a lot of that on the like using Garchomp end, just because you have at least the one single target ground move you're not going to have to deal with your partner for. And I think probably 99%, not maybe 99, like 90% of Garchomps were Groundium, and then we had some Scarf and then some Sash, or I don't know, some stragglers after that.
Yeah, but Groundium was basically it's brand new. It's like something it had been waiting for such a long time, basically, until it got Stomping Tantrum, which kind of does something similar, but not quite. But yeah, it was a pretty quick format. You know, a lot of things are carrying these huge like base 140, 150 power moves as a result of everything getting access to Z crystals. So you can kind of see by looking at both of these teams up on the field that the whole format was kind of about trying to find ways to slow down the pace of the format, and the teams that were kind of like most effectively able to do that were pretty successful. So we've got some Aurora Veil, we've got some Trick Room, we've got some Will-O-Wisp kicking around, and we'll talk about the matchup here in just a minute. But before we get into that, the two players here are huge American names, right? Household names at this point in their careers, but at this time they're both basically in the midst of like breakout seasons or breakout 12-month periods in the case of Drew. So Justin Burns now is, you could argue, the best player in North America, but if you don't want to make that exact argument, definitely top 5. I don't think that is arguable at this point, but here he's still looking for his first major win, I believe.
Yeah.
So he's kind of got this reputation as like, you know, a really good player, moving into the top tier of players here, but doesn't really have the championship belt to show for it yet. And then on the other side is Drew, who I believe has 2 regional victories at this point.
Yep.
One of them, his first, was 12 months ago, the 2016 St. Louis Regional Championship. And then he had also won, I believe, Dallas, you said, Jake, in January of this year. Yeah.
It was the second regional in this format in the U.S., so he won Dallas. That 2016 Collinsville, that was like a legendary tournament, because we had the one guy who just kind of showed up and won a bunch of games and then like famously swaggered through top cut, and then Drew stopped him in the finals, if you remember that.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. That was like the Big Six with Clefable. Yeah. I remember that. Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, Drew, it's his hometown regional too, so that's pretty cool. He won in 2016. Tried to come back and defend and made top 4 here. I guess we should say this is the top 4 of St. Louis regionals in 2017.
It is.
I believe March of that year. So like you said, we've had a little bit of time with the format. This is probably like the 4th or 5th regional in the format, I'm wagering. And so we've seen a bunch of team structures kind of take shape. We definitely talked a lot about GACT last time we had a 2017 match, and Andrew has something similar.
Bits and pieces, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he has the GCT part. I think in this case, the Buzzwole kind of replaces Arcanine in terms of like covering some of the same things, like obviously like steals, and it's kind of a damage soak, especially for physical moves. But otherwise, it finishes off with a Feeny and P2. But the Buzzwole, I think, is pretty unique, and it's not really something that had caught on at all at that point.
And it's not something that ever would catch on, with the exception of a very specific Rain archetype that made itself known in multiple international championships.
Yeah.
Of course, that was Tommy, the legend of Double Ducks. For whatever reason, had a Buzzwole on it. He could explain it to you. Nobody else could.
I'm willing to believe Tommy was part of the reason Buzzwole's on Andrew's team too.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, he definitely was.
It has some it does some pretty cool things. Like beating Garchomp and Snorlax pretty handily is a good reason to use it.
Yeah. Tommy is kind of like a, I don't know if notorious is the right word, but we'll say notorious for today. But like a notorious team builder, a notorious influence on team building.
Yeah.
Buzzwole was one of his big Pokemon that he was trying to talk people into the whole format. But anyway, so that's Drew's team, and then on Justin's team, this is like kind of the framework of a team that would kind of like pop up at certain points. Different elements of it would pop up kind of like throughout the format. And I think at least the Ninetales Garchomp piece of it, which I think is really important, was also huge in the World Championships, because I think that's what Zelda was using in the finals.
Yeah,
that was kind of like a big piece of his core. But another important piece of this team, and it was specifically like this was its big coming out party, I believe, was the Tapu Lele Drifblim combination with Psychic Seed, Drifblim, and then it would use Tailwind and like Will-O-Wisp and just like make Tapu Lele a nightmare to deal with for everything else. And it was still a little new around this time, and people hadn't like figured out great ways to deal with it, especially in team building. So it's kind of like pretty influential in this tournament in the hands of Justin, and it again would pop up at certain points throughout the format, so that's important as well.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we can get into it here. So we've got lead matchups here, and obviously everybody is hoping to see Buzzwole, but I think because everybody in the room is hoping to see Buzzwole, there's kind of more of this mind game about whether or not it's actually going to show up here. But
it's really hard to bring Buzzwole into Lele Drifblim. Those are just two really hard stops to it.
Yeah, and Justin knows this as well, and so does Drew, obviously. But this Drifblim Lele stuff, you can kind of already see that Justin's got kind of a handle on it, where he's figured out, like everybody here knows that like Tapu Fini and something bulky is like the best way to deal with the lead combination. Yeah. So you just put your Lele in the back, and you get your Psychic Terrain up the next turn, and then you just dodge a Muddy Water, and you're good to go.
You dodge a Muddy Water, but get an accuracy drop on the other one.
Yep.
Take it away. Return Porygon 2 is something that popped up at certain points throughout the year too. Not something that we'd ever seen before, but because download was like the go-to ability.
Yeah, there's no reason to run Trace here.
Yeah, the Trace, you don't get a whole lot of value out of Trace sometimes, and it can throw off a lot of things with all the terrains and whatnot. And so you always ran download, and if you're running like Bolt Beam like normal beforehand, you just like lost out entirely on a attack boost, so people started running Return.
Yeah, and it was valuable for hitting things like Tapu Lele too, but here is kind of like the calling card of the whole format here, which is these Z moves. And another calling card of the format is doing a ton of damage to bulky Pokemon with resisted attacks. So Tapu Lele is going to do far too much damage to this Celesteela here, and even though it switches in and it's resisted, it's still taking a ton, but regardless of that, this is still like a pretty good position for Drew, because even though you take a lot of damage, you've got it onto something that's going to heal itself back up anyway.
Yeah.
And just kind of like blowing a Z move without like losing the game that turn is usually a positive kind of occurrence for you. Yep.
Yeah. I think it's still a pretty good spot for the Celesteela, but if like the one thing that Justin can do to it to really neutralize it is burn it.
Bring Arcanine.
Okay, one of two things is burn it. So I think he wanted to make sure that wasn't going to happen. The Drifloon is probably at like 60 or 70% in terms of hitting Will-O-Wisp at this point, just because it's at -1. But all in all, that's a pretty safe switch and not really something that can be punished, and capitalizes on this Arcanine switch as well.
Yeah, so Drew there kind of like preempts the Arcanine switch a little bit because I think it's pretty obvious what's coming, and gets the Tapu Fini onto the field. Now, I believe that this is a supportive Tapu Fini set that's carrying a whole bunch of like utility moves. And we kind of have that more evidenced by the fact that it doesn't Calm Mind there, because otherwise it could just have like
Calm Mind.
turned itself into an absolute nightmare for the rest of the game by getting 1 and potentially even 2 Calm Minds up here. But instead it's just going to take the knockout. Tapu Lele is going to get back onto the field, and now this is just kind of like Justin trying to stall out Trick Room for the next 3 turns.
Yeah, the burn on Porygon 2 coming in very handy here. I think a lot of times in the past, if we were ever to burn a P2, it just mostly to be as something like a way to chip it down.
Damage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But now return makes it pretty big value because you have a lot of less damage going into that Tapu Lele.
Right, there's a double accuracy drop there. Yeah, Muddy Water is not great. Anytime it works itself into the meta, and it's kind of like Tapu Fini's best water type option anyway, so it's pretty miserable to have to face it. But you kind of see what can happen if you're trying to play defensively against Tapu Fini, where like even if it's not really doing a lot of damage to your team, like that Arcanine takes the attack pretty well.
Yeah.
That it's just like throwing a lot of volatility into any potential like end games that you're playing towards.
Muddy Water is a support move. Like, let's be real. Especially on a set like this without Calm Mind, it is a support move.
That's fair. Totally fair. Yeah, so both players here are kind of like trying to set up for their last turn of Trick Room here, where Justin knows that Trick Room is ending and he wants Garchomp on the field, and Drew knows that Trick Room is ending and he decides that he's going to hard switch into his Tapu Koko with the likelihood that Tapu Lele has to play passively there. And it does. So as Trick Room ends, this is like a pretty good offensive position for Drew.
It is, but it also kind of illustrates one of the biggest downfalls of Tapu Koko, and that it doesn't really have fairy moves. It has Dazzling Gleam, which it ran almost all the time, but the fact that it's spread and not very strong, and typically Tapu Koko doesn't have great special attack anyway. Like Garchomp pretty handily stomachs a Dazzling Gleam. I don't think it would have knocked out from that point either, so you still have to be a little bit careful.
Yeah, and I think so. Weren't some like if you were running like Dazzling Gleam, Assault Vest Koko, like if Assault Vest Garchomp, it was like a 3-hit KO or something like that. It just like does like absolutely terrible damage.
Yeah.
But we kind of saw there, Justin goes for a double protect on his Tapu Lele, knowing that the end game is very much not in his favor, and trying to like get one extra turn with his Tapu Lele. Because had he gotten the protect off, it would have kept Tapu Koko on the field, and then Earthquake would have been able to knock it out. So that was kind of like the last sort of out that he's playing to, and then eventually this is going to be able to be sealed up pretty cleanly.
Yeah, at this point, obviously, Garchomp's in Dazzling Gleam range. Tapu Koko cleans this up pretty much immediately, just because you just don't switch. You don't give it a chance to catch it with a switch or an Earthquake or something. Justin can pretty easily take 2 KOs or try to call something with a Swords Dance. But at the end of the day, the Koko can come in and Dazzling Gleam it. The Arcanine's attacks are going to chip it down even further. Muddy Water is going to probably put it back down to about where it was to start the turn. And so just pretty safe play to end here from Drew.
Yeah, there wasn't really. I guess Justin kind of found. I don't think there's even really an out there, right? Is like even. I think you need a Muddy Water miss onto Garchomp.
Yeah.
It's a hit Arcanine. I don't even know. Anyway, with Tapu Koko in the back, this is pretty much over. Obviously, Thunderbolt Volt Switch is going to clean this up. And now we're kind of looking towards game 2 at this point. So he's going to throw Volt Switch just to not reveal any more information. But my thoughts on the way that that first game went is that Drew was kind of like a step ahead at leads, and then especially in the first 2 turns, which is where he was kind of able to generate momentum, where he catches the Shattered Psyche with like a clever use of Celesteela, and it was just kind of like Justin wasn't really expecting him to play his counters to Drifblim Lele in that way. and now seeing that, he's got a better idea of what he can do to kind of like slow down that game plan. And I think we see that here in game 2.
Yeah, and I think this issue with Justin's team is that the only way he has to like burst damage the Celesteela is the Arcanine. Something like Garchomp, we saw the Swords Dance. A lot of them ran Fire Fang. I believe this one's Rock Slide though, so that's not going to do too much even at a boost. Snorlax has to boost up pretty far to actually start doing some chip damage. And so I think, like, obviously I think Justin was trying to catch Celesteela with a burn early on in that game. And if that's something he can accomplish, he might give himself time to like make sure that his carries can kind of damage Celesteela, but as soon as Celesteela starts throwing Leech Seeds out, it's going to be a little bit difficult for Justin, so...
Yes. Yeah. It's a hard wall to break.
Yeah.
Such that in some matchups you start side leech seeding and some of that
yeah. Oh god.
nightmarish garbage. But we're here into game 2 with big difference in leads from both players here. We see Drew's Garchomp come out, probably as a reaction to trying to deal with Arcanine, which was sort of like the biggest problem that he faced in the previous game. And then Snorlax makes its appearance, which ended up being a pretty influential Pokemon throughout the format. And I think this one is Curse, right? This is a Curse set.
It's Curse, High Horsepower, Recycled.
Okay. Yeah. So that was a little more prominent early format before they kind of like gave way to pretty much exclusively the Belly Drum ones, and it was just kind of a matter of how you'd fill out the team. But I always really liked Curse, and I think at some point people are running like Curse Thick Fat at some points to like deal with certain threats. So there was definitely like some Curse stuff going on. Yeah, was that this format though? I think it was, right?
Yeah, Virginia.
That was yeah, that's right. I casted that one. Duh. So yeah, this is kind of like where Snorlax kind of like hangs its hat here, where it's staring down a whole bunch of special attackers. It's already got one boost that it got relatively for free, and then it's got this Arcanine, which is basically like its preferred supporter on this team.
Yeah, I think immediately that's a really good adjustment from Justin. Again, Buzzwole is very, very hard to break into Justin's team between Arcanine, Tapu Lele, Drifblim, Ninetales. Like, it's going to be difficult to have Buzzwole on the field and make sure it's not being threatened by something so it can superpower the Snorlax. And so throwing Snorlax right in the field right away, you get a chance to get some curses up. There's really nothing else on Andrew's team that threatens like big damage immediately on Snorlax. And so it's pretty certain that you're going to be able to get a curse or two. And then maybe start firing off some returns after that.
Yeah, so I guess one of the things I'm thinking about here, and maybe it's like not a point worth discussing, but you can kind of see here where an Arcanine instead of a Buzzwole might be kind of a nice Pokemon to have.
Right. Yeah.
Where you can switch it into Ninetales like basically no problem. And then you're intimidating down the curse boosts with like switching in, switching out, and you don't have to basically like structure a whole game plan around like chipping it down to exactly 51% and then like hitting it with a Tectonic Rage or something like that. Which is like obviously a pretty difficult game plan. So this Snorlax is like basically impenetrable at this point. You can see how much damage it's doing with, I think it's just at +1, right?
Yep. Correct.
But it gets to keep the boost the whole game because there's no Intimidate.
Yeah, and that's going to be the big thing for Justin. Like, as soon as you're at +1, that sticks. You can even curse a couple more times, get to 2 or 3. But in no scenario can you be dropped from your boosted attack. And so I think, especially now, you've cursed, you're at +1 attack and defense. You know that there's a Garchomp and a Type of Coco. You're not going to be taking a whole lot of damage. Like, there's no world in which you get knocked out in one turn. It's like, You're going to be able to fire off another attack or two, probably more, just because we know how thick Snorlax is. And between like Arcanine and whatever else Justin has in the back, he's created a lot of space for this Snorlax, especially with the Porygon being so low too. Like, there's not a whole lot of space for Drew anymore.
Yeah, and there were entire like months worth of this format where people were just like playing around with the best ways to create space for Snorlax in the current meta, and obviously this is a pretty good example of it here, where outside of terrain and behind the Aurora Veil, Snorlax is taking like, what is that, 15% from a modest Life Orb Volt Switch. So there's simply no way to deal damage to it at this point. And I don't think Drew's Garchomp is Swords Dance, so that would potentially be one of the other outs for it, and that doesn't even exist.
No, I even forgot about the Aurora Veil before I was saying all that too. So this Snorlax is not going anywhere. And I think that's something that Drew, like at this point, Drew probably knows that. and you start to think, okay, what can I do to like better prepare myself for the Snorlax next game? Just because with how well this has gone, Justin brought Snorlax into Fini, Coco, Garchomp, Porygon when Andrew had Celesteela Buzzwole in the on his roster. It's like even then, just making that call on Justin's end is really smart, because I think as soon as you make that call and Drew doesn't bring those two Pokemon, you are immediately set up in a good spot.
Yeah, you pretty much win, barring like some pretty severe mismanagement.
Yeah.
But yeah, a combination of Shattered Psyche and whatever Snorlax wants to do is going to seal this game here in a minute. And you kind of know, based on the way that Game 2 went, that we're going to be seeing either Buzzwole or Celesteela, and it seems highly likely that it's going to be Celesteela making its return, because it's just like, I don't know, like a more comfortable game plan, I suppose, where you don't have to think about Tapu Lele running around, and if you don't know your -1 calcs with Arcanine running around and things like that.
Yeah. It's just, I don't know. I think Justin at Team Preview put himself way ahead in that second game.
For sure.
And even from then, he just set the Snorlax up as well as he needed to. Like, it's curse turn 1 and then just return the rest of the game, and that's all he needed to do.
Yeah, he ate a berry one time. That was pretty cool.
Yeah. That was pretty cool. Refused to elaborate.
Oh my god. Okay. Yeah. So game 3 here. Yeah, I mean, I can pretty much kind of say a lot about Game 3s just in general, where basically like both players have thrown their best punch in Game 1 and 2, and now it kind of comes down to who can adjust the best, or better execute the game plan that they utilized in the game that they won.
Or I mean, even there's an art to kind of concealing information too. Yeah, we keep coming back to the whole topic of at this late in the tournament.
Yeah, we talk about it all the time.
There's probably no concealed information. On the off chance that Justin doesn't know Andrew has Nature Power Tapu Koko, that's something that could come in handy for Drew. He probably knows. Like, we're not going to sugarcoat that.
I think that's pretty new at this point too, isn't it? Where
I think so. Yeah.
I think at this point in the format, everybody was like, "Oh, how are you running 2 Tapus? How could that possibly work? Like, they all need their terrain." Well, it turns out Tapu Fini doesn't that much, and Tapu Koko, like, it likes it, but it's not critical to its existence. So, yeah, that was kind of a cool tech that started showing up a little bit.
Yeah. I like this lead from Drew, though. I think this lead is very flexible on Drew's end, and it lets him not show his cards right away, too. Because let's say you have either the Buzzwole or the Celesteela in the back. You don't want to immediately say, here, I have it. You're going to have to play around this. And specifically, we've seen Taunt on Tapu Fini already, so if the Snorlax is on the field turn 1 again, you have the option to force it not to curse. And so I think even that alone makes this a much more playable lead if the Snorlax was to be here. Clearly it's not, but I think that's just a smart lead. Because nothing on Justin's team is going to knock out Tapu Fini in 1 anyway.
Right, and I think Tapu Koko is always kind of a smart lead anyway, because like the worst case scenarios will switch out. But you can kind of see in this lead, I think, what Justin is thinking in between games is like, I have to be immediately prepared to deal with Celesteela, like as soon as it takes the field, and I think that this lead reflects that.
Yeah.
All right, roll tape. So turn 0 here. So there's a lot. This is like a very flexible lead for both players, and there's a lot that they both could do. But Justin's going to go immediately back to Snorlax, knowing that this was like kind of the position that he got his curses up in the first game, right? Which was like a combination of special attackers. Aurora Veil goes up, and then Snorlax gets to do whatever it wants to do. But Celesteela is here to say no, especially as Arcanine leaves the field.
And this is ideal for Celesteela. Like, if you had to pick 2 Pokemon on Justin's team, maybe the Tapu Lele. But you really want the Celesteela to be in on the Snorlax, for 1.
Right.
And it heavily threatens the Ninetales as well, especially with the Focus Sash broken. And so this is going to force Justin to act immediately, whether that be to bring Arcanine back in, whatever else. It's just much less of a immediate Snorlax setup into firing off 6 returns and the game's over.
Definitely, and there's no clear way to dealing with with Celesteela too, because Arcanine's going to do its best here, but it has to answer to a muddy water as it takes the field, or at least not on this turn, because Taunt is a little bit more critical. But a Heavy Slam, probably should have been a Leech Seed.
Possibly, yeah. I don't know. I think that was a very risky Arcanine switch, and it obviously worked out. But I think there's a world where Drew calls that Justin doesn't curse because he knows taunt is a possibility.
For sure.
And so like if Drew calls that Muddy Waters here, the game is much more perilous, I think, for Justin. I don't know. The Snorlax, it is taunted, yes, but we saw Return still do a big chunk to Tapu Fini. There's not really anything that's going to take less than 30 or 40 other than the Celesteela that's already on the field, so it's still a pretty solid spot for Drew, I'd say, at least defensively.
Definitely, and he managed to catch the wild charge there with the Garchomps, which is another huge switch. So both players are making like some big moves here as Celesteela gets its first Leech Seed down, so this is going to start to add up over time, and it's kind of tricky to play around the Leech Seed spam. I don't, everybody that's played the format has had to do it because sure, you switch out, but you're switching out and another Leech Seed is going down, and then you're taking chip damage and you're opening yourself up to attack. So it's like very tricky to play around and puts on a lot of pressure because it does like it does what, 25% over 2 turns? Like that's so much damage. That is so much damage.
I think I respect that turn from Justin a lot though, just because the Wild Charge return covers really any switch. Like Tapu Koko would still take a ton from that. Garchomp obviously under half already. And one of the better ways that people figured out to deal with Celesteela is just to ignore it, make all its friends go away, and then come back to it. Obviously, you have to preserve what your best option is, in this case the Arcanine, but I think that's just a smart play, trying to get rid of one thing while... Because Celesteela, like nothing's going to get knocked out by Celesteela. You might take a Leech Seed. Oh well. You have a Berry, you have Recycle, whatever.
I do think it's a little tricky in this situation, though, because come back to it when your best option is an Arcanine is a little scary because, like, Tapu Koko, once Arcanine has taken any amount of chip, is gonna pin it. Tapu Fini deals with it handily, and then obviously Garchomp is putting a lot of damage, or threatening a lot of damage onto it too. But anyway, he catches the Tectonic Rage with the correct slot, but that does make it a lot harder to deal with Arcanine, especially as Ninetales takes the field. So it was positive to take out Snorlax, but I don't know that, given that Celesteela is your win condition, that it might not have been better to just like blow the Tectonic Rage into the Protect of Arcanine.
This is one of my favorite turns ever. I want to say, because that Icy Wind.
You love Icy Wind turns. You love.
Okay, that's true. I do love Icy Wind, but
I think we talked about it last time too.
We might have. I don't know, but I think the obvious thought there would just to be Blizzard. Like you Blizzard, knock out the Garchomp. Celesteela or Koko takes a decent chunk, if they were to switch in. But Blizzard probably would have knocked Tapu Fini into Berry range. And I don't think that Wild Charge would have KO'd it then, which would have allowed Tapu Fini to Muddy Water. Most likely that's what it was going for. Maybe knock out the Arcanine, but more importantly, get Arcanine super low so it's harder to deal with Celesteela. And just the forethought there to Icy Wind Wild Charge to not proc the Berry, I don't know that I would have thought of that in the moment. I don't know that a lot of people would have.
I would not
just
have.
because it's such a niche interaction too. That's something Arcanine damage calcs. Like how much Wild Charge does to Tapu Fini, and you don't think 25 plus Berry is going to be enough. I just love that.
It's definitely and those are, I think niche is the word you used for it, but those kind of situations where the team well enough and like the mechanics of what's going on in the game to be able to make that kind of play.
Yeah,
I wouldn't have, but I am like a known Blizzard enjoyer.
That's true. See the logo in the middle of the screen.
A little bit of a disadvantage in that regard. But yeah. That said, this is still like a pretty good position for Drew here. Like this is a good offensive position where Tapu Koko is definitely going to be able to knock out Arcanine here with definitely with a Nature Power Thunderbolt and potentially with a Volt Switch, and then Celesteela is going to get to answer back. But we saw the Icy Wind already, and that's got to be what the Ninetales is doing here now.
You would think, yeah. I don't because Hail ending there is actually really good for Drew because it just takes away Aurora Veil and doesn't take away Blizzard, but clicking Blizzard outside of Hail is very risky. So it just takes away those options, and I would imagine Icy Wind comes there just to make sure Arcanine outspeeds the Tapu Koko.
All right.
This nature power interaction is so funny. Like
this is what I was gonna say. Is the one nature power interaction that you don't get to see that much? Although I suppose, what is it with Bulu Energy Ball or something like that? I don't even know.
Yes, it is.
So this is one of the few times you'll ever see a Tapu Koko use Psychic, and there's a reason. There's a reason that it doesn't do it that much, as Arcanine's able to hang on. And then this is going to be like the big this is basically Justin's entire team right here.
Yeah, pretty much. I think the Psychic there still does the same damage as a Thunderbolt in no terrain would have. So like, you lose no damage there into the Arcanine. It just come very, very short. Not very short. Very, very close to knocking it out, which I think would have been the game. Not I think. That definitely would have been the game. But that Arcanine being able to survive, and it's specifically the Tapu Lele being able to reset that terrain, I think is obviously that's how Justin wins here. If that's a Thunderbolt that goes into Arcanine in electric terrain, it gets knocked out. Clearly, you can see from that damage it would have. And I just like resource preservation in that case. Like I think knowing that the Tapu Koko has nature power, you know that the Tapu Lele is a lot more valuable than just the damage it can put out, because you throw off nature power, you throw off some damage, and you still have the big like Shattered Psyche nuke too for later on.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty interesting to see Psychic Terrain used like as a defensive damage reducer as well, because that's kind of like the one thing that you don't really think of it as doing, where you're like, okay, cool, I want to block status, sweet. Okay, cool, I want to bring Alakazam on my team and like do a bunch of psychic damage, that's fun too. But you don't ever really see it used to mitigate damage, because Tapu Lele doesn't really like to be switching around or like doing those sorts of auxiliary duties as much as it likes to be clicking psychic attacks and like moving very quickly and things like that. So it's really neat to have that end game in mind. And then obviously you brought it up and we talk about it almost every week, in that the information preservation with nature power is like critical here in the way that Justin's able to play the end game.
Yeah.
Anyway, really good set there. So we see Justin advance to the finals here before he is eventually knocked out in his quest for his first regional championship by Alex Underhill, another one of the best North American players at the time. So this was like a really stacked regional, top 8, I believe, if I remember looking back at some of the other names that were up there as well. But a really cool match to see. All these matches that come down to the wire are really neat, and this is kind of like a pretty good example of a format where there are kind of like some ideas floating around, but there's not really like a true established metagame, and that really allows like team building and meta reads to shine.
Yeah, I think we started to see some of the like structures come into place at this point, because that like the Tapu Koko, Garchomp, Celesteela structure is something that persisted. Drifblim plus Terrain Setter persisted, whether it's Tapu Fini or Tapu Lele. Most of them are Tapu Lele, but I know that Raghav won a regional with Fini Drifblim as well, and so that stuck around a little bit. And even, like you said, the Ninetales Garchomp combination got second at Worlds that year too. So even that part of the team, which you probably would expect to be kind of the least replicated, at least, just because Ninetales is a little bit inconsistent sometimes, even that we saw later in the year. And so a format like this with the regional formats, I think, are really fun to team build in, just because you have so little that everything else becomes more valuable, if that makes sense. Like, it's if everyone's super, no one is, that whole thing.
There you go.
So it's interesting to see what people pull out, and I think Ninetales was an example, Blissful is an example, though we didn't get to see it. And the Drifblim, I don't think that Justin like pioneered that, but he was one of the first people to like use it very, very consistently. And so that was a good one,
and
too.
it kind of took off right after that, I think, too, before it was kind of undone by fake PG, because like Fini Gigalith. Anyway, we could talk all about. One of the interesting things about the regional format is that it's like very easy to track meta developments too, because there's so like fun. A very small amount of Pokemon. It seems like there's a little bit less randomness to what's successful at what point in the year too, which is really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, we don't have to continue to talk about that. That's going to do it for us. We're going to, of course, be back in 2 weeks with another match. It won't be 2017. We'll probably stay away from 2015 because we've done that a couple times too. So we'll try and find something new and creative for 2 weeks from now. But until then, thanks for coming with us and listening to us ramble on about Pokemon. We appreciate you watching the videos. If you have any feedback, of course, you can find us on social media. You can find us in the YouTube comments. We are now content creators in a brave new world of content creators. So I don't know. We're
I think we might be the first
contemporaries of Iono.
I think. Oh my god, not that. I was gonna make a dumb joke, but I don't. That's enough. That's a good enough one. Oh god.
Anyway, thanks so much. I will be back with another episode in 2 weeks.